Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about countering doctored narratives. Now, the US billionaire George Soros' recent comments on India have come under heavy criticism from all sections, with the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar terming him as an old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. In fact, a few days before George Soros' comments on India, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankhar had warned against doctored narratives becoming hurdles in India's growth. Addressing Indian Information Service probationers at his official residence in Delhi on Wednesday, Vice President had asked the young officers who handle the media wing of the government to guard against sinister designs that try to hurt India's growth story.
If when India is on the rise, sinister designs are there to set afloat a narrative by free fall of information, we have to be alert. This is another way of invasion. We have to boldly neutralize it. We have to stir in us a spirit of nationalism. We cannot allow free fall of doctored narratives to run down our growth story on so-called reputations.
So how is India tackling this disinformation campaign? What are these doctored narratives and why is it important to counter these narratives about India? To try and understand more in detail, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Mr. K.V. Prasad is joining us here in the studio. He's a senior journalist, been keeping a close watch on all the developments, both inside and outside the parliament, in terms of narratives which are set across. We also have with us Mr. Jaishankar Vempati. He is the former CEO of Prasar Bharati, and retired Major General Dhruv C. Katoch, Director of India Foundation, is also with us. Welcome, both of you gentlemen, as well to Sansad Television. I'll begin with you, General Katoch, and let's first start by asking the basic questions. One, what are these, doctored narratives? Why are they floated? And, why is it important to counter them?
Vishal, the point is today, information is a very key element of warfare. When we speak of information warfare, it is not something which is which is just a sort of a concept devoid of hard power. Information can really get into people, and you can create waves within society which can actually destroy that society. Now, information has been used as a weapon from time immemorial. It is not something which is new. But the very spread of the media, the way media has spread over the decades, especially over the last 2 decades, it makes the media a very, very powerful tool. And now with the coming in of the social media, it has become even more powerful. Mm-hmm. So how does it operate? One incident which takes place anywhere, and let us say an incident has taken place of it could be stowing a throne somewhere. When you magnify that in multiple channels, thousands and thousands of times, and repeat the same thing every day, that one minor incident which would have been ignored, which is actually totally irrelevant, it galvanizes the people to say, okay, a particular community is under threat. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example. It has also been used for regime changes. Now, at the moment, there is an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, which is about to complete 1 year. In 2004, when the color revolution took place, it was inspired by a change of regime where the Western forces, they actually pumped in huge monies. They created a narrative and the government was overthrown.
Okay.
In 2014, 10 years later, in the Euromaidan protest in the same place, the president of Kyiv, the president of Ukraine, was again overthrown in these protests. Now, how were these protests organized? There was an organization behind it. A narrative was created, and that narrative was propagated time and time again over a period of time. They galvanized the people, and we had a regime change. Mm-hmm. The color revolution, which you see in the Arab world, are also an example of this. But let us come closer to India. narrative. In 2014 or 2015, the narrative was churches are under attack. Now, that is a false narrative. But when it was magnified so many times, hundreds of times by different people all across the world, even President Obama made that reference, to minorities being under threat in India. Lynch mobs. Now, somewhere in a country of 1.3 billion people, 2 or 3 people get lynched. I mean, it has been happening every year. The lynching takes place because of various reasons, cattle theft, etc., etc. It is not communal. But you put a communal angle into it, and suddenly you get a narrative, Muslims are under threat.
Okay.
The Citizenship Amendment Act, the farmers' protest, the Sterlite Copper, the protest on Sterlite Copper, the nuclear power plants, all of them were narratives. They were narratives built to discredit India, and ultimately the main aim is India should not become a strong economic power, because then it will be a competitor to the West and to other powers like China and Russia. So they want India okay as a reasonably friendly power, but not as a powerful country.
Okay.
And both the West and others will do their hardest to build narratives to put India down. And George Soros' statement where he said, I will pump in $1 billion here, that is really to build narratives. They will build narratives so that when the elections come in 2024, when the elections come, they will attempt, they won't succeed,
okay,
but they will attempt a change in government. It's a regime change operation. Vishal.
Okay. Let me bring in Mr. Vempati here as well. Mr. Vempati, you have on numerous occasions put forth your views on the issue of how foreign media portrays the India story. Now, that's one part. The other part is, statements made by billionaire and philanthropists like George Soros, which has come under heavy criticism. The question is, are they same, or are they closely intertwined, or are they different?
See, there is, I think, an ample body of evidence of collusion between what are activist groups which have certain causes, certain agendas in mind, and global media outlets. And we've seen this coordinated sort of strikes happen periodically, right? For example, there were these series of exposés on illegal safe havens for tax havens, right? Like the Panama Papers, for example, where you had an NGO sort of coordinating the release across multiple media outlets in India as well as abroad, right? So it's not without a precedent where the activist groups, which have certain targets and certain agenda in mind, have been coordinating with global media outlets to put out a narrative. And then we've seen this over the years on multiple occasions. What we've also observed in the context of India specifically is that there's a very particular kind of narrative, right? That democracy is receding, democracy is in danger. This has been repeatedly built up over the last 2 years, 3 years, and that is what you're seeing manifest right now in the context of even where one particular business house, whatever issues they may have with their corporate governance, that is somehow being projected as India's democracy being revived, because there'll be questions asked and so on and so forth, right? So completely absurd parallels are being drawn, primarily because there is this confluence of interests between activists and global media houses, and that's playing out in Indian politics. And being an open democracy, we are vulnerable, and that is why it is important that we find creative ways to insulate Indian democracy from these narratives and these agendas. Okay.
We'll come to that aspect there as well, as to what those ways can be to counter those narratives. But let me first bring in Mr. K.V. Prasad here as well. Mr. Prasad, you're a veteran journalist. From your point of view, how would you analyze these kind of narratives which are built, as both the gentlemen, General Katoch and Mr. Vempati, were also pointing out, when we're talking about individual statements coming in, perhaps with vested interests, as well as in the case of George Soros, and the narratives built in the mainstream media or via the social media channels as well, which is a very important tool of disseminating information nowadays?
Well, Vishal, I'll just point to two things. One, this is an inherent challenge that happens in a democratic setup. If you're a free country, you have a free speech, you have freedom of expression, you tend to get these kind of information. And that is where it's very important for journalists and others to do their due diligence, as we call, before we actually start looking at it. And here I want to distinguish in a way, with the social media, there are very few filters available. unlike the traditional media, which has filters in place, which actually goes through a process, credible process to try and discern and see what is fact, what needs to go before you release it to the public. In social media, one gentleman or one person who has an opinion tweets his or her opinion, and then it magnifies. It has an amplifier effect. Some people may accept it, some may reject it, some may just say, "Oh, maybe, I don't know." So it's like a very iffy kind of situation. So this is what starts, as both the fellow panelists did mention, the narrative is being built. But I also believe that having had a democratic setup for the most 75 years that we are mature as a democracy. We have seen successive elections happening smoothly. People are discerning enough to understand what exactly, after all, people may try to set narrative. But I'll come to that portion later. But just a quick setup. If you remember, not very far back, 2016 elections in America, there was still an investigation as if the whole thing was Russians have interfered with the American system. There is no, I don't know what kind of any report that has come out. So that's the largest, one of the most powerful democracies on the earth complained. There was a congressional hearings on that. There was a downswing in the relations between Russia and United States. It still remains on the downside.
Yeah.
So this is a live example of what democratic challenges are all about, which I was speaking.
Okay. Mr. Vempati, I'll come back to you and we'll take it from where you left, the way we need to deal with these challenges, tackle these, disinformation campaigns or, distorted narratives, which we call. How do we do that? Because the challenges are pretty much, in a very, not in a defined manner. Social media is one aspect. Statements coming in from, established figures like George Soros, of course, being a billionaire and philanthropist, capable of, investing more money into realizing his narratives is one part of it. Then, narratives in the mainstream media as well. So, how do we deal with all of them? Because there are games being played at different levels.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's a multi-pronged attack, so to speak, right? And so one of the first things I think we should learn is that, our response generally tends to be very reactive. I think we need to get out of that. We can't always be in this firefighting mode where we are reacting to whatever is being thrown at us. We need to have a more proactive approach where we put out, the India story, put it out in the right perspective and targeted at audiences at various levels, because it's not just the op-ed columnists, the opinion makers, right? You also have to put out, a broader narrative, which is, which appeals to the common public as well in these various countries where, these things are being played out and amplified. So that would require, one, of course, India to have a very strong platform, global, news and media platform, which we currently lack. And I think that is something that should be, taken up on a priority. We have a few examples. We have, DD India, we have Beyond. And then some of our digital media platforms have a reasonably, global audience. But that's not sufficient. I think India needs a very strong voice, global voice, and I think that needs to be created on a priority. The second thing is we have a number of foreign correspondents here in India. Their understanding of India is very superficial, very peripheral. They tend to go largely by the narrative that is dominating in the English media elite in Delhi. I think we need to proactively engage them and then show them the broader country, right? So they appreciate that India is not just what happens in Lutyens Delhi. It is much bigger than that, much more diverse, much more complex. And they develop an appreciation for what goes on in the states, what goes on in the regional media, and have a more holistic, view of India. I think that's the second important thing that we should be doing. The third is, of course, an institutionalized response, right? I think the challenge that we have is that we have not invested enough in, institutional mechanisms by which India can be understood and explained to the world. So, for example, one column that I wrote recently, where I observed that there's very scant content on India in Chinese language, for example. Most of the content on India in Chinese language, in Mandarin, is largely sourced from other, international media outlets. So that is the area of concern. So we need to build this capacity in different dimensions where internationally people have multiple avenues to understand the new India that is being built under PM Modi's leadership.
Okay, okay. So expand our, outreach and put the India story out there first to counter those doctored narratives. Would you agree with that strategy, General Katoch, or there's something else also which needs to be done? Also, specifically with respect to the kind of narratives which are put by public figures, like the recent comments coming in from Mr. Soros.
No, I agree totally with what has been said. You see, but I would just like to expand on a few other issues. When I've spoken to some foreign journalists based abroad, they have sourced the material from Indians. You see, and there are a large number of these Indians are working abroad. In Cambridge or Oxford or New York or what have you. They're working there. They source the material from there. So once they get it from Indians who are based there, they simply publish that without any, let me say, without any due process. Now, who are those type of people who have been there? Mm-hmm. There is a particular type of Indian over the last 40 to 50 years who have ensconced themselves in those universities, and they have become professors, etc., public figures there, at least in the field of journalism. And they have a particular leftist orientation, which is very, very noticeable and visible, and they have a powerful voice. Now, I think what we need to do is to also put across, to send people to foreign universities, etc., in various roles, right? To give out the present position of India. Mm-hmm. That is one thing which I think we need to be very proactive about. Now, what are you being challenged on? We are being challenged on democracy. Now, this is the one country which periodically holds elections every 5 years. Every state goes through an election. The person who loses, they criticize the election commission. When the opposition wins, they praise the election commission. Everybody understands that game. But everybody respects the election commission because power keeps changing hands. At least in the states, it's been changing hands. And in the center, it will continue to change hands at some point of time. So we have a very vibrant democracy. And I think we need to tell the people up front, we are a vibrant democracy, stay out. Okay. The second thing which they want to hit you on is human rights issues. Now, when I, as an army personnel, when I look into the human rights records of the Indian Army per se, there is no country in the world which can even match close to India. If we are at a record of, say, 95 to 98%, when we do things correctly on the human rights issue, countries like Pakistan are at the base at about 0 to 5%. The United States 10 to 15%, including the Western European countries. They cannot match us in human rights. Okay. We should not take nonsense from them. The narratives which are being built, they build on India as an intolerant country. Now, how is these intolerance, the minority rights are threatened, India is being intolerant? How are these narratives propagated? They are propagated by certain groups within India who are receiving funding from abroad. Mm-hmm. I think we need to keep a very, very strong control over that funding, at least see where is the money coming from. The CA protests and the farmers' protests required 1 crore rupees a day. Where is that money coming from? Mm-hmm. Now, if Soros is going to give $1 billion, that comes to 20 crore rupees per day for 1 year. That is the amount of money which he can actually pump into this country. Mm-hmm. Now, you can imagine what sort of narratives he can build. Okay. So I think we need to be aware, one, look into the foreign funding, have our own narratives. We should be proud of our narratives. Various narratives have actually started going out, when we are talking on the cultural aspect, the yoga, etc. My own children who are abroad, they very, very clearly tell me that when they walk in the streets, whether it is Singapore or New York or London or Australia, they are looked at with much greater respect today. Okay. So obviously that narrative building is going on. So we are building a narrative, but we need to be conscious of what the opposing narrative is going to be. And before they can propagate their narrative, we must put across the correct picture first. I think we have to be very, very proactive, as stated earlier by my earlier speaker, Shashiji. Mm-hmm. We have to be very, very proactive. Okay. And that is how we win the narrative war. Okay. Mr. Prasad,
being proactive in putting out our side of the story, India's story, is what both Mr. Vempathy and General Katoch is referring to. You being part of the mainstream media, how do we do that with a proactive way? How do we give it a push?
No, I think successive governments have had a very clear policy as to what it needs to tell the world in different quarters, in different times, and what's the India story all about. There is a slight difference when I would like to point out, since one of the panelists did point out. The point is today, the way we have a huge Indian diaspora outside, okay? All of them form their opinion, based on their own experience, either lived or from their people who are out here. They're also interacting with their own friends, colleagues, they form their opinion based on that. And as somebody who has worked in the US Congress and I've dealt with the Indian Americans and as a India caucus work, I've seen this, they come up with notions which you have to kind of understand why are they coming from that notion. And once you start looking at it, you will understand that, okay, they have collected some set of information which may not be exactly fit into the thing which is actually happening. So that you need to tell them, look, this is what it is, put it in the right perspective, and there is an appreciation of that. So this constant engagement is one aspect of international relationship, and do not we know that Indian diaspora, be it US, UK, and elsewhere, they play a very significant role both in contribution to the local economy, in the country's economy, and also building the Indian brand. Today we are respected because of the kind of contributions they make. So they have their own understanding. So that's one reason you need to look at that.
Okay.
We are free to say what we have to say, right? And we will continue to say that this is the right thing, this is what's happening. It is an opinion that matters over a period of time. And I think that's something, it's a gradual, and I do agree with, I think Mr. Vempati did make a point, we don't have to react to everything. We have to kind of distill it and understand what needs to be countered. And for instance, we've been talking about Mr. Soros. I mean, fair enough, he, and I think our External Affairs Minister characterized him in his 4 words. Eventually understand whatever Mr. Soros may say, it is the Indians who are going to vote, and they have a very fair understanding of the way the government is working.
Indeed.
So I think that's where the strength lies.
So not being reactive, but proactive is the strategy there as well. One last question to you, Mr. Vempati, and taking a cue from what you said earlier there as well. You've been at the helm of affairs at India's public broadcaster. Now, when we're talking about, this outreach mechanism or, trying to put our story first, being proactive about it, 2 things. One, Indian government's information wing, that's one. And 2, India's public broadcasters. How do they play a very significant and important role here? And what more can be done? There is a lot of information which is put out there, but are we? Do we have to, sort of tweak the way we put the information, or do we have to push, give it a push to the kind of information which we are putting?
Both. I think the kind of information is important, and it's not just information in terms of news, right? Let me give you 2 examples. There is the Press Freedom Index, where India was ranked at, whatever, right? And then just last week, I read the Reuters Institute of Journalism. They've identified Mexico as the most dangerous place on the planet because they've had more journalist deaths than even war zones like Syria and Ukraine. Now, Mexico is ranked above India in press freedom. Right? It's absurd. So we have to work at some of these institutional mechanisms as well from an information standpoint, not just news, not just narratives. So the kind of information is important. Second, how we put it, right? And strengthening the public mechanism, public platforms is very, very important. Look at BBC, for example. Their funding runs into tens of thousands of crores, right? So we can't match, a BBC or an Al Jazeera when you're funded at much, much lower levels, a few hundred crores. So that is something that the government seriously needs to look at. That how do you professionalize the public broadcasting infrastructure, bring in professionals, just the way, for example, Sansad TV operates, and also put in a lot more funding, because if you have to build a formidable global platform, it will require funding on a scale where you can go head to head in competition with the Al Jazeeras, the CNNs, and the BBCs of the world.
Okay.
So both fronts, what needs to be put out and how it is done, I think both need work that needs to be done by the government.
Okay. The content and the strategy both are equally important there. Thank you so much, Mr. Jaishankar Vempati, General Dhruv Katoch, and Mr. K.V. Prasad as well for sharing your views and insight with our viewers there about the need to deal with doctored narratives, how to counter them. Of course, as our panelists were pointing out, sort of multi-pronged strategy is required to deal with this issue at various levels, and that involves putting India's story first, being proactive about it. We'll keep a close watch on all the developments here and keep on bringing you details on other important issues also. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.